This is Michelle Wetherbee, Chief of Transitional Services Unit of the Massachusetts Parole Board. And you've been there since 2017. Prior to being Chief Wetherbee served as Deputy Chief as well as a Transitional Parole Officer for the Parole Board for 15 years. And prior to working for the Parole Board, you worked for Pepperell Police Department and Templeton Police Department as a dispatcher. You've also worked for Essex County Sheriff's Department for 10 years as a teacher. You've had many, many different hats. Chief Wetherbee taught Title I and created an educational component of the Community Correction Center in Lawrence, Massachusetts as well. Chief Wetherbee is a graduate of Fitchburg State College before we were Fitchburg State University, with a bachelor's in elementary education and sociology, and is in the home stretch of her master's of public administration. One more class to go. When you're not working, you like to study. I don't know if you like to study, but you do study and spend time with your children. And thank you so much for spending some time with Fitchburg State and sharing your story and your insight with us.
All right, thank you. The key part is discussing Massachusetts Parole Board is the fact that many people don't know the differences between parole and probation, so the pure essence of what we do sometimes gets lost in that mix. Massachusetts was the first state to ever create a parole board, and that was in 1837. So parole board consists of 7 board members that are appointed by the governor through the governor's council. And with that, the parole board members have to go through a very rigorous interview process with the governor and then the governor's council before they're appointed. The other parts about parole is that we're not just, as I often say to people, officers running around the street to chase down or work with the people out in the streets. There's multi-units, I should say, in parole. We have human resources and we have a fiscal unit. We have, as I said, the field services unit, which most people associate with parole is just the field. The field officers are the ones that work hand in hand with the parolees that are released to the community. And then we have a life sentence unit. The life sentence unit deals with all second-degree lifers. Anybody that's been sentenced to life in prison, we call them lifers, but it's technically, if you're serving a second degree, you serve 15 years before you see the parole board, but you're on parole for the rest of your life. We also have the Office of General Counsel, which is, we have our own team of attorneys that work for us. They work in multi-platforms. They sometimes have to go to court. Sometimes they have to explain to us certain laws so that we can apply them to the offenders, either inside or outside the walls. We also have a research and planning unit where we literally perform our own research to talk about recidivism, talk about how many people we've actually returned, how many people we've paroled out to the community. We have a victim services unit. The victim services unit, I'll get into each one of these units more as we go. Victim services, we have a set of coordinators that talk to the victims of these offenses to help them sometimes process what's happened to them, but also to give them a voice at our parole hearings. So then the last unit I'll talk about is Transitional Services Unit that I'm actually the chief of. In order to be paroled, you have to be incarcerated. That's the difference between parole and probation. So to be incarcerated, to go in front of the parole board, you have to serve either half of your sentence if you're a house person, house of correction, or the minimum number of your state sentence. The only way someone can get out on parole is if they see the parole board, which means they go through the Transitional Services Unit, or TSU as we call it. TSU meets with every single inmate that wants to see the parole board, and we do a risk needs assessment. So there's several parole officers in every single institution across the Commonwealth. There's 37 prisons and house of corrections, anywhere from Edgartown, there's one, all the way out to Pittsfield or Essex County. We have one right in Salisbury as well. So there's a parole officer, if not 1, 2, in every institution, along with an administrative person. So every inmate sees a parole officer to discuss their parole plan and to do a risk needs assessment. Because to be released on parole, you have to have a home plan in Massachusetts. You can't go live in a shelter. You need to have a solid plan. So each person, as they go in front of the parole board, has to have that plan worked out. And part of the parole officer's duties is reentry. Make sure somebody has a solid plan. Many people, I'll give you an example, would think of a sex offender. A lot of people would not want a sex offender released early. But as I tell people, I try to educate people of the fact that it's better for that person to get out to the community while they have supervision, because then somebody can help them find jobs, they can help them with counseling to treat their issues and to monitor them just in case something goes wrong and they sometimes reoffend. So if you have somebody out, again, on the sex offense that's out on parole, do you want them just released to the community with nobody watching them? Or do you want somebody out there helping them, monitoring them, and make sure they're doing the right thing? They say that if somebody has parole, they have a less of a chance of returning back to incarceration because somebody has worked with them to establish themselves out in the community. That's what the transitional parole officer does. Again, they help with reentry, they help with plans. In some cases, they help somebody get denied parole because not everybody is suitable for parole supervision either. Once somebody goes in front of the transitional services parole officer, which we call them TPOs or IPOs, they go in front of the parole board. The parole board has the sole decision authority in the Commonwealth for any matters that are granting parole or revoking someone's parole, taking it away. A judge can't tell a parole board member what to do. There's litigation that can occur that's a little different, but the parole board member gets to make the sole decision. Someone seeing the parole board in a house of correction only has to see one board member, where somebody serving a state sentence has to see anywhere from 2 to 3. If you have been committed to a life sentence, or we call it lifers, you have to see all 7 board members. It's a full board hearing to determine if you should be released on supervision. Once an inmate or offender sees the parole board, there's a whole set of, if they're granting it, there's a whole set of conditions that are given to an offender to make sure that we monitor them to the best of our ability, but to also help the offender not come back inside. Always think of parole as a way to prevent someone from being reincarcerated, to help them reenter society, because every single person that's incarcerated today is going to be released unless they're serving first-degree life. So we want to make sure they have the skills necessary, 1, while they're incarcerated, and 2, when they're released. Because many of our offenders don't have these skills. They have a difficult time adapting to society, and they need someone to help them along the way. Some don't have birth certificates and also security cards. They don't have mass IDs. Some of them have been incarcerated so long they have never driven a car, or they have no idea how to use a cell phone. So in some ways, the parole officer in the field helps them with those things. So once, I'm going back and forth in circles on you guys, feel free to raise your hand if you got a question. I'm used to doing this in person rather than this whole virtual world. Once a person sees the parole board and they're granted parole, they get released to, again, I said, a approved home plan. There has to be somebody that's willing to take them in, support them, help them along the way as well. Because as I said, many of them, they don't have job skills. They need that help, and we need to make sure they're going to a home plan where someone's going to support them with that transition. The field services unit covers all that part. Once you're released from incarceration, you have to report to a regional field office in Massachusetts. There's 9, plus what we call a warrant unit and an interstate compact unit. Because some offenders don't choose to stay here in Massachusetts. If they're from New York, if they're from California, they can go back to those states as long as they have an approved home plan. So once they report to one of the 9 field offices, they're assigned a parole officer. That parole officer works with them on their reentry, but also works with them on making sure they stay in line. Drug testing, alcohol testing are standard mandates of the parole board. You can't use drugs or alcohol while you're on parole, not even a single drink. If you're caught drinking, in many cases, you could be returned back to prison for that. Drugs, we have a very strict policy in regards to drug use while on parole. So people are drug and alcohol tested, but we cannot reincarcerate you if you overdose or if it's your first time testing positive. Our job is to work with the offender to help that person manage that addiction problem. Obviously, that applies to alcohol too, but we want to help the offender try to work through those problems because part of addiction is relapse. So not everybody is meant just to be reincarcerated due to the fact that they relapse. Sometimes they go to detox. Sometimes we up their supervision from living with their family to a sober house or a long-term residential program to get them what they need. So if you follow me so far, we got parole officers inside the walls that help them develop solid parole plans, interview them, and put them in front of the parole board. Then we have the parole officer out in the community that works with them and their families or whoever's supporting them to try to make them successful out in the community. Does that always work? No. It's quite often that somebody will reoffend, they'll violate their parole in some way, shape, or form. So they get returned back inside the walls. And that's where the TSU unit steps back in and deals with the revocation process because it's liberty. Once you've been released, your liberty is at stake. So it's a very long legal process that we have to do with the offender if they violate their parole. Other parts of the field services unit in the field, they do carry firearms. We all have our own state cars. If you're a manager or in the field, you have a state car in order to transport the parolee. But a lot of people don't realize is that the field officer is on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Unless you've put in for vacation, your parolees or the police department who's arrested your parolee, they can call you anywhere from morning till 2 o'clock in the morning. I myself received a call, and it's kind of abnormal. A good example is a second-degree lifer is released on parole. I worked hand in hand with him while he was inside the walls, helped him with his reentry plan. His reentry plan was to live with his sister. He didn't know his sister at all. He had been incarcerated since the age of 17. He shot another gang member, so he got second-degree life. But he had never really known his sister or his mother, his family, but his sister wanted to take him in. My suggestion was that he didn't do that because he didn't know his sister. And it probably wasn't in his best interest to all of a sudden get to know his sister so intently, like one-on-one. So, but he chose not to listen to my suggestion. And he's released. He's living with his sister. He's actually working for his sister and her husband as well. So now they're in control of his housing and his employment. He doesn't have a birth certificate. He doesn't have a social security card because he was raised in foster care. He calls me at midnight. That's kind of unusual because I technically cover the inside of the walls, but his field officer hadn't answered his phone calls. Come to find out, his field officer is getting a new work phone, so he couldn't answer that. This second-degree lifer is being kicked out of his house at 11:30, 12 o'clock at night. He didn't know what to do. Technically, he has to have an approved home plan. He was at a loss. He doesn't have very many resources out there. What was he going to do? We worked it out with his sister that his sister was going to keep him that night. If not, he was going to be back inside MCI Walpole, Cedar Junction, for probably up to 5 years is what happens. So we worked it out. His sister kept him. And then I worked it out to get him into a sober house program that actually accepted people that didn't have drug or alcohol problems. Sometimes it gets a little difficult when someone doesn't have a substance abuse problem to get them housing because there's very little transitional housing out there for people that don't have drug or alcohol problems, something that we're actually working on right now. So the next day, it was Friday, we got him into that program, and by Friday night, he moved into this program. Now he has to find a new job, new field officer. He has to start all over again. But the plus side is he's starting off out in the community rather than inside concrete walls. That's just one example of different things that we work together on, and why a field officer is literally on call 24/7. Somebody cuts their bracelet, their electronic monitoring bracelet in the middle of the night, you're being called, you have to go. So a lot of people don't understand that a field officer, you're in high demand, you're working a lot. On the transitional side, inside the walls, for the most part, we have the luxury of working 9 to 5, just Monday through Friday. We're not on call, and we get paid more. Working inside the walls, the ladder to move up, working inside, you make more. The salary base in parole, we're all considered law enforcement. So we can retire at the age of 55 with 80% of our pay because we're at risk. To be a parole officer, you're in the risk in the community. If obviously you're dealing with some violent offenders. But on the other side of that, if you are working inside the walls, you're in a dangerous environment every day you walk inside of a prison or a house of correction. It's not always pleasant to walk in. Some examples I can give you of that is I had, when I was a parole officer inside, I was a TPO. I was dealing with an offender that had mental health issues. They're pretty significant. He liked to store things in his body. Pens, razors, he'd literally embed them in his arms. And he would put razors in the back of his teeth where his cavities were. So when he sat on the metal detecting chair, they couldn't pick up on it. Or when they wanted him, they couldn't pick up on the metal razor blades. Because if prisoners like to, when they shave, sometimes remove the razor blades out of the razors and use them as weapons. He put his up inside of his gums and his teeth, and stored them there. So he saw the parole board. He was angry because the parole board went over some of his disciplinary tickets and the fact that he was very assaultive to correctional staff. And at that point in time, he got very angry. He came running at myself and the 2 board members. There's no correction officer in parole hearings. It's just the parole officer, the offender, and the parole board. So I had to block him from getting to the board. That's our responsibility, is to protect our board members. And then the correction officer came and dragged him out from there. He got loose of the correction officer and came running down the hall at me next. So we get paid for that, the fact that we're at risk. We're always careful about that too. Those are extreme cases, but a lot of people think that if you're only at risk when you work in the field, when inside the walls can be just as crazy. We try to work with the offender, every single one, as if they're all starting off in a level playing field. You don't want to prejudge anybody starting inside or outside based on their criminal history or what got them incarcerated. Some people just make mistakes and they get incarcerated. Many people have family members that have drug problems, especially nowadays with the major drug issues we have in this country. So I don't imagine any family hasn't encountered some of those problems or have friends or family members that are incarcerated. So as a parole officer, inside the walls or out, we have to treat everybody the same, except for you always have to worry about your own personal safety. So I'm going to go back and forth. It feels a little weird just sitting here chatting. Does anybody have any questions so far, comments? I'm usually doing this in a classroom setting. It's kind of weird doing it over here. So any questions so far, anybody? No, everybody's still quiet.
No, yeah.
Okay, here. Kyle, you go first.
I might have missed in the beginning. Is there like an academy, like in a police academy, to be a parole officer?
That's something I wanted to touch base on too. No, there is an academy, but in order to become a parole officer, either inside the walls or out for a transitional or a field, you have to take a civil service test. to take the civil service test. That is actually, I've requested a new civil service test for entry-level positions that we're hoping to happen in the spring. Once you make it through the civil service process, both units have their own training academy. The field is, I believe theirs is up to 6 weeks. My unit is up to 5 weeks so far. If you're out in the field, you learn how to, obviously you have to qualify with a firearm. You also learn defensive tactics, drive safely, all those things. To work inside the walls, we do some of the same things, some defensive tactics. We don't carry firearms because firearms are not allowed inside the walls of a prison. And there's a lot more involved on my side in regards to the laws. We have to research many different laws to apply it to somebody going in front of the board. There's also a training called our risk needs, which is the level of service case management inventory. It's called an LSCMI. That's a week-long training that all officers across the agency have to take. So each unit does their own training, and it's anywhere from 4 to 6 weeks. But then you have on-the-job training. You have a field training officer that works with you. Inside the walls, you have your supervisor that works with you day in, day out. Because parole's huge in the sense that there's so many little tiny details that people need to learn in order to do their job effectively. And it takes years to learn that. So it takes a long time. When I spoke in regards to the civil service exam, that's just a test to get you on a list. And then we go from there. Our civil service exams also go for promotion as well. So in order to be a line staff to a supervisor, you also have to pass and score well on the civil service exam as well. Did I answer that for you?
Yes, and you said that you think maybe in the spring there might be some civil service exam.
That's what I've requested. We're working with the Civil Service Commission to have that all the exams come up in the spring. One suggestion I would have for people is don't take one test. Take the institutional test and take the field test. One way to get out, I know a lot of people love the field. I can honestly admit that was my aspiration when I first started. But to get out to the field, you're better off if you have the experience inside because it shows that you can do the job. It's an important role of this hiring process for us. I'll touch base on hiring and then I'll get to Noah's question. Hiring here, we look for people that have, one, scored well on the test. You need to have some form of degree. Internships. When I just hired 13 parole officers 2 years ago, some candidates that I looked good on paper, but they didn't have any form of experience with anything. They spent their 4 years just going to class. So I cannot reinforce internships more than anything. You need to have some experience. You need to get to know what you want to do as well. And it makes you a more rounded candidate for us. The other thing than hiring, not just for parole, I have worked with many federal wardens, sheriff's departments, social media. If you're posting stuff on your social media that an employer shouldn't see, especially if you're going for law enforcement, think twice. Underage drinking or drug use, crazy partying, which I know most college students like to enjoy, don't put it on your social media. We do look at that. We look at what you are all about. It's not just how you test or how you interview. We also look at those pieces. I know the feds are very big on credit score. If you are severely in debt, other than obviously your student loans, which I think 9 out of 10 people have, if you're reckless financially with your credit, the Federal Bureau of Prisons won't hire you. We don't do credit checks per se, but we're going to ask you those things. One thing I'll touch base on is we do a psychological evaluation. So it's not just for the field, you have to pass certain physical tests. You also have to pass a psych eval. So that's part of our hiring process as well. But we call everybody. Our background checks for law enforcement have to be very, very deep. So one person literally, they called like their, I think it was like middle school teacher. just to get more information. If you're going to the field, they're going to go to your house. They're going to talk to your neighbors. They're going to talk to whoever you live with. If you'd moved recently, they're going to go talk to your old neighbors. I'll give an example of if you've had a domestic in your house, which we all, that can happen in anybody's house. But if it's a reoccurring event and you're the aggressor and it comes out, do we really want to hand you a firearm? If you drive recklessly and you've got 10 tickets and 3 car accidents, do we want to hand you a state car with lights and sirens in it? No, we don't want to give you those things. So you have to really think about that, even starting off in college. What you do now affects your future, especially in law enforcement. Speaking of the language, I love those candidates because any language, we have a lot of people that are incarcerated that speak multiple different languages. And it's so much easier to really talk to the person if you know their native language. The interpreting services are not the same. So candidates that speak multiple different languages, they're a win if we can get somebody that is multifaceted in that way. All right. So Noah had a question? Is Noah still gone? Anyway, he said he had to come back and forth. Anybody else? Any other questions before we go? All right. So another part of our agency is the victim services unit I brought up. Some inmates, in order to go in front of the parole board, it depends on what their offense is. Their victim is allowed to attend their parole hearing. So when the victim attends their parole hearing, it's a very powerful hearing for both the offender and the victim, because the victim is sitting right in front of the person that committed some form of offense on them. It's usually violent offenses like assault and batteries, sex offenses, death cases like a manslaughter. The victim can give input. In a lot of those cases, it's very difficult for the inmate to hear it and for the offender's victim to sit there and say their story in front of the parole board. But that's a powerful hearing. And so we have, as I stated, a set of coordinators that speak to the victims, both prior to someone getting parole and upon them being granted parole. We have to loop them in of literally the day the person's being released. The victim is entitled to know that. So we work hand in hand with the victims. So in our agency, it's not just a law enforcement piece of somebody working inside of a prison or house of correction or out in the community with the offender. We have admin jobs. We have re-entry coordinators out in the field that work with the offenders when they get out. As I said, we have research and planning, where we're rather small of an agency in regards to that. We only have, I think, 3 positions that do research and planning. So you have the statistical part of our agency. And again, the victims unit, which works hand in hand with the actual victim. Then we have inside of our central office, we have program coordinators that do many different things, from what we call office votes, which is more of an administrative thing, to work through someone's hearing, to supplying different information to the institutional parole officers. We also have a program coordinator that is a fleet manager. We have over 100 cars in our agency that all have to be, not just, it's not the mechanic, but the person that tracks them all, make sure people are driving appropriately. Because if any one of us, we have little GPS squares in our cars now that tell the state how fast we drive, where we're driving to, how long we idle somewhere. So I'm sitting on the side of 93 sometimes during work. They get a report that states that. I did get a notice that I had 68 infractions last month of driving over 85 miles an hour. Sometimes I just forget how fast I'm driving because it's driving everywhere. So I did get hit on that one. So that's another piece that somebody does. They monitor our driving. We can't use, certain cars have the light bars in them. If you set off the light bar, that even is told to OVM. We have the human resources side where we have somebody that assists with the hiring, does the paperwork, does medical, dental, stuff like that, union membership. But in regards to hiring, the unit chiefs, myself and the field chief, we do our own hiring. We set up our own interviews. We set up our own process. HR only steps in when it comes to benefit coordinating. Because myself and Chief Simons, we are very we're OCD about our hiring practices, because we want to make sure we have the right fit. Because once you get through your probationary period, we own you. Like, you are part of us now. Like, we can't just walk in and I say, oh, I don't want to work with John Smith anymore. He's my staff for the rest of his life, as long as he wants to stay in parole, unless obviously something significant happens. So picking out a candidate is so important. So Chief Simons and I do our own interviews. Then, as I said, there's a whole legal team here. So if somebody wants to go to school to be an attorney, parole pays better than the DA's office, believe it or not. That's an incentive, because a lot of our attorneys here came from district attorney's office or defense attorneys that wanted a more regular schedule. So we have them as well. The key about parole is case management. Everything, it's hands-on. You're dealing with your offenders inside the walls and outside in the community. And our key is public safety. Everything we do is based on public safety. We don't want to release somebody that is really a bad candidate for community supervision, because, for instance, my signature is on that parole permit that released somebody. If they go out and hurt somebody, I'm going to feel like I own it, because I put that person in front of the parole board, I walked them through the process, and then I sent them out. And I don't want to put my officers at risk, them out in the community. So everything about us, it's all about public safety. And we want to make sure that ourselves and the community is not at risk when we release somebody. I'm trying to think of what else. When somebody violates their parole, as I said, we bring them back inside. The field officers literally drive them to the prison or house of correction where they came from, and then they sit in front of the transitional side. So all of our units work hand in hand to make sure that it's done effectively and safely again. I can't say that enough. As Kyle mentioned about our training piece, safety is paramount, not just to the community, but to the officers inside the walls and out. That's why we do a lot of like defensive tactics. Self-awareness is a key. You always have to be aware of your surroundings. So we do a lot of training in regards to that as well. The officers that work inside the walls, I can't express enough. They put their lives at risk just as much as a field officer, because we don't have a correction officer that sits with us. So it's important for that piece. I'll go off on a side about internships. We do internships. I would suggest that if that's something you're interested in, you can reach out to me. That Lindsay has my email address, and we can coordinate things for you. My interns, I like to give them a taste of everything. Not everybody's meant to run around the streets chasing offenders. Not everybody's meant to be inside of a prison or house of correction. So we give you a taste of life sentence unit to see how the lifers are done, victims, victim access hearings, which are not open to the public. So the only way to see those is to either work for us in some way, shape, or form, or research with my interns where they're working. In many cases, I put the interns inside of a prison or house of correction. My last one was at Sousa Baranowski and Shirley, the Supermax. So the person got a taste of how that all worked, working in a Supermax. My parole officer there worked with the student over the fact that they weren't sure if they wanted to actually work with offenders in a parole capacity. So we hooked them up with Department of Corrections to sit down on some reentry. There's teachers to give the person a taste a little bit about everything. Sat down with a correction officer to see how the prison worked and the different jobs that are available that way. And then they would come into central office with me and again, sat with the victim, sat with research, sat with the legal team to do a little bit of everything. Because I went to college to be an elementary ed teacher. Now I'm the chief of the parole board. It's totally different. Obviously, when I was younger, I had no clue what I wanted to do. But I feel like giving a sense to an intern of different things that are out there. We also had this young lady go into a field office, do a ride along with field officer, experience what that was, so that she could decide what she wanted to do in the end. And obviously, again, internships. It's the only way to get jobs nowadays. The candidate pool is really big out there. It's competitive in criminal justice. To be a police officer, to be a parole officer, to be a correction officer, it's difficult. It's not an easy job to get into. You have to really have a sense of getting to know people and what you want to do, but get your foot wet. Get in there and try it. Because Lindsay said, my background is I did teach for a year in an elementary ed school. Back then, there was not very many teaching jobs available, so I ended up teaching in the prison. I actually loved it. It was a great opportunity for me. And then one day I was offered, someone came to me and gave me a civil service posting and said I'd be good at it. So I took the test. It took me 5 years to get hired because civil service can take you a long time. So if you even have the slightest thought it's something you want to do, take the test when it comes out. It's always on mass.gov. Take the test. As I said, again, it took me 5 years to get my position. And that was just an entry level. From there, I worked in a couple police departments. As my bio said, I worked at Templeton. I worked at Pepperell in a couple of different capacities. I had stepped away from the teaching and went into that for a year or two when my children were very young. So it worked out that I got a taste of law enforcement on that side. I also went through the part-time police academy so that I could be a part-time police officer. That was all part of my interest at that point in time when I shifted gears from the teaching to the corrections or criminal justice side. And the day I entered parole, I didn't know where I was going to land. Parole, we don't tell you where you're going to be placed. You could be placed anywhere in the Commonwealth. That's both for the field and my unit. Once you get hired, you're literally told, we're going to select a place for you to work, and that's where you're at. Until you get a bid. Everything goes out to bid every so often, and that's the only way you get to move. But once you get your foot in the door, you get to seniority, you get to select more of where you want. Just like if you work for a police department, you don't get to pick your shift. You're going to end up on 11 to 7 or 3 to 11 because nobody wants those shifts. So we kind of along the same lines. Personally, I try to match my staff up logistically where they live to where they work, but also the personality of the supervisor and the new staff. If I know two people are going to totally clash, I don't want to put them together. It's going to be a bad learning environment. So sometimes you get a longer drive to be with a better supervisor that fits your personality. The field does it along the same lines. It's not always where you live. It's a good fit. Where your need base is. If we pick out that you're really great working with a particular type of offender and we have a large offender population in that area, you might get placed there. We don't want to put anybody where they're not happy and where they can't learn. So when you're entry level, that's the key. You might always not like where you're assigned, just like in a police department, but it gives you a way to start. I know a lot of people want to go to the field because it's got this glamour to it, but it's really busy. Old days parole, a lot of parole officers used to park their car at the beach and sit there and watch, sit on the beach and do their work that way. Where we had an issue here a few years ago where a parolee killed a police officer, that changed how we do business. Everybody is always on the go. That's where our risk needs came in, and we do a lot of things called case notes, documentation of every interaction you have with the offender out in the community. It has to be documented because God forbid that ever happens again. The field officer and the institutional parole officer has documented every single thing we've done to show that we supervise them and we provided the offender everything available to them. So if they go out and they reoffend, we're covered that way. So again, any more questions? I feel like I'm rambling on to all of you.
I have a question for you.
Sure, Lindsay.
Why have you stayed in this field for so long? What keeps you coming to work every day and not, say, switching back to elementary education?
The fact that it's different every day. I don't deal with the same type of offender every day. One day you could be dealing with somebody that has a drug addiction. Next could be somebody who literally likes to rob people. There are people out there that actually like to do that. And getting to know them, getting kind of like it's trying to figure out the mystery of why they do what they do. It's important because you want to stop that behavior if you can. And it's kind of crazy sometimes working inside the walls because you're dealing with every single type of person, place. I've worked at myself. MCI Concord, there's a Concord Farm. I've worked at Sousa, Baranowski. I've worked at Worcester House of Correction, Suffolk House of Correction, Framingham, MCI for the females, and Walpole. So for me, it was moving around, getting a different variety of things that I could learn. I stayed in my position as a transitional parole officer for a long time, and the chief at that time saw something in me and asked me to be her deputy because to be management, you're not on a list. And within the first 2 months, I went from line officer to, I skipped being a supervisor and I became the deputy of my unit. She informed me that she was becoming a parole board member, and she wanted me to be the next chief right behind her. I had only had 6 months in management. I was petrified. I didn't know what I was doing. I had no clue. Nobody taught me how to be a manager. Nobody taught me how to deal with staff or staffing problems or budgets or anything. I knew how to deal with offenders, the parole board, and all of a sudden I was thrown into a new role and I had to learn her job as well very quickly because she was going to leave me. So the change, nothing is ever the same in parole. I always tell people it's not black and white, it's gray. The answer I might give to somebody today could actually be different tomorrow because it's to apply to a different offense. The offender could be living somewhere different. So nothing's ever normal. Everything could be chaotic and crazy and moves around. I miss working with inmates now that I don't get to do it as often. I try to do cases about 5 a month. Normally, chiefs don't go back inside the walls. I do. During COVID, I implemented a system that if any one of my, because there's COVID inside the jails and House of Corrections, we have had a period where there hasn't been COVID. But a good example is last month, one of my supervisors tested positive. There was 137 inmates that had tested positive and 30 staff. So when I removed him from his position for a couple of weeks so he could get better, I go in, I take over that place, I run it. I removed all my staff because they'd all had contact. So they had to stay home. I covered the entire place on my own. So being able to do that has been interesting. I've learned a lot about my staff and what they do that I didn't know they were doing. And so it's implemented some changes. The fact that I like to be hands-on. I've worked in police departments, as I said, from the dispatcher. I've worked in training to be a police officer. And to me, that kind of boring. It wasn't fast enough paced. You sit in a car for so many hours and write speeding tickets. Believe me, writing a speeding ticket can be fun. But working on the inside, it's always changing. It's moving. You don't have the same inmates all the time. In some cases, in some of the state facilities, you do have the same inmate all the time. The second-degree lifers, they can be with you for years. I call them my pet projects. That was like the second-degree lifer I just mentioned with the housing issue. I have stepped back and interviewed another lifer that I worked with for several years to find out what we could do different to give them more stuff inside before they get out. Because the key is everybody's going to get out of prison or house of correction sometime, unless they're, as I said, first degree lifer. So having that opportunity to learn different people, different needs, and try to find them those resources is great. My own personal history, my brother's been incarcerated. I've got family that has substance abuse issues. So to learn more about that has given me a different perspective of even how to work with the offenders that I work with. So it's always changing. It's evolving. And as chief, I've changed a lot, even myself. When I started, we had 1 week of training. You had to learn your job in 1 week and get thrown in. So that's why I've increased it. I started off with 4 weeks. I have some new staff that hopefully starting soon will go up to 6 weeks. And then I do a couple of crazy things where they have to meet with me once a month and let me know how they're doing, what could be done differently. The key for me is being open to change. Myself and my staff, training them. I always try to find new, different things, because even back in 2018, there's a whole new criminal justice reform that changed how people were sentenced or how they were released. In my time in parole, we've gone from 1 type of parole to 3. Now we have a mandatory parole and we have a medical parole. So it's always changing, learning something new and applying it. Any other questions? No.
You can be brave. You can either unmute yourself or you could type your question into the chat.
I do have one question.
Go for it.
Have you ever dealt with any inmates that had to go to solitary confinement?
Quite often. I've interviewed them in solitary confinement. It's called segregation or SMU. They're still parole eligible. I usually suggest to an inmate that they postpone their parole until they get out of the can. That's what we also call it. As a female working in a correctional facility, you have to have the understanding that you're dealing with everything. And sometimes in segregation, they're not so pleasant. You could have somebody that's in there for positive urine, or you could have somebody that's in segregation because they're violent or offensive language. And I think I've dealt with a little bit of everything in that situation where inmates have yelled and screamed, sworn at me. As I said, I've had quite a few attempted assaults. So segregation has changed though with 2018 criminal justice reforms across the entire United States. You can't keep anybody in segregation for any extended amount of time now. So all institutions have step down programs where you can come out of segregation and you go into like a step down block to learn how to behave or get back into general population. One thing I want to mention is not everybody in segregation is in segregation because they're a disciplinary problem. Some people opt to go into segregation because they're afraid. There is a prison hierarchy. Certain offenses inmates don't particularly care for, and so they tend to put themselves in segregation. Sometimes that can be by starting a fight, or sometimes that's just saying you're a risk and you ask to go in. And we call them PCs because it's protective custody for them. Or in some situations, gang members have a conflict with one another inside the same gang, and you want to PC yourself because you're afraid of your gang retaliation. That happens quite often as well. I know there's a recent thing that I had read that in Massachusetts, you don't usually sit with your gang table. You don't. In Massachusetts, most prisons I've come in contact with, it's where you're from. So if you're from Springfield, you sit at a Springfield table. If you're from Lawrence, you sit at a Lawrence table. If you're from Dorchester, you sit at particular tables according to what street you're from. So Massachusetts is a little different in that sense, where the federal system, they tend to stay with their own gang members, and it's also racially based in most of the Fed prisons over where you sit. And where you sit at the dining hall, or chow hall, we call it, is important. If you sit at the wrong table, that could put you at risk. You both internally and for correction staff, if you're labeled as a gang member, that affects you for your entire incarceration, because once you have that label, it all depends on should you get parole. If you're now labeled as a gang member, have you addressed that issue? Inside the corrections, they document it because now you might have to be watched for certain behavior. Because if there's going to be assault on one gang to another, they're going to, who you sat with at lunch that day could affect where you end up at the end of the day. Any other questions?
Let's have a few more minutes. Any other questions? Well, if anyone thinks of questions, I will throw my email into the chat. Same thing, if you want to get in touch with Chief Wetherbee, let me know. Just reach out and we can connect you. But yeah, any final words of wisdom before we sign off?
Suggestion, if as I tell many kids, even my own daughter who's in college, is social media, your driving record, and your credit. Don't forget those 3 things. If you want to get into this field, not just parole, don't speed like I do. Social media, again, watch what you post. Everything stays out there. Every picture you take, and everyone says, oh, Snapchat doesn't happen. But we see everything, we dig, and we dig deep because we want to make sure whoever we hire is safe to hire. That's about it.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with us. And yeah.
Thank you for the option. Anybody wants to email me, feel free. If you didn't feel like you could ask a question here, Lindsay has my email. She can share it with you all and let me know what you have to ask.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a great day, everyone.